Carney announces $1.2 billion to protect Canada's lumber industry after new U.S. tariffs. Meanwhile, Anand pushes back on comparisons with Mexico, defending Canada's unique trade relationship with Washington. Subscribe now to follow the next developments. Carney vows $1.2 billion bailout for lumber sector hit by Trump tariffs. Canada does not dump lumber into the United States, and we will continue to make the case that these current and proposed duties are unjustified, Carney said. Prime Minister Mark Carney promised as much as $1.2 billion to shore up Canada's lumber industry, which has been hit hard by U.S. duties that are about to significantly increase. Carney said Tuesday that up to $700 million in loan guarantees will help forestry companies of all sizes maintain and restructure their operations. He also pledged $500 million in grants and contributions for product development and market diversification. Canada does not dump lumber into the United States, and we will continue to make the case that these current and proposed duties are unjustified, Carney said in West Kelowna, British Columbia. We are a vital supplier to our southern neighbor, representing around a quarter of the U.S. market and helping to keep down the costs of American homes. The dispute between the U.S. and Canada over softwood lumber stretches back decades, with the U.S. periodically imposing duties to counteract what it claims are unfair Canadian government subsidies. The U.S. Commerce Department is expected on Friday to conclude hiking duties on Canadian softwood to about 35% from a previous total of 14.4%. That's a combination of anti-dumping and countervailing duties. U.S. President Donald Trump has escalated the fight even further, ordering an increase to U.S. lumber production and an investigation of the national security risk of lumber imports. The probe is under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, which Trump has already used to place new tariffs on steel, aluminum, and copper. Canada shipped $40.3 billion of forest products and building and packaging materials to the U.S. last year, its fifth largest category of exports to its largest trading partner. Carney said his government would launch its promised home-building agency, called Build Canada Homes, in the fall, which will prioritize Canadian lumber, steel, and aluminum in construction. It will also require companies contracting with the federal government to source domestic lumber. As well, the government will draft new initiatives to diversify international markets for Canadian lumber, along with retraining programs for workers, he said. Canada has long denied the U.S. claim that it sets artificially low stumpage rates, fees sawmills pay to provinces to harvest timber from government-owned forests. The World Trade Organization in 2020 largely backed Canada's argument that U.S. levies were unfair. But that stance may be softening. Last month, British Columbia Premier David Eby told Bloomberg News that some Canadian leaders are open to a quota on softwood lumber exports to the U.S. in order to resolve the dispute. The Canadian industry is already suffering due to U.S. duties, while production has grown in recent years in the U.S. South. The Trump administration's policies may accelerate those trends, but they also risk driving up housing prices, as the U.S. will likely struggle to replace the supply of Canadian lumber in the short term. Trump last week hiked tariffs on imports from Canada that don't comply with the North American Free Trade Pact to 35%, from 25%. Carney said Tuesday that he will speak with U.S. President Donald Trump when it makes sense. I haven't spoken to the president in recent days, Carney said. When asked Thursday about the prospects for a trade deal with Canada, Trump said that he's called, seemingly a reference to Carney. Carney said the average U.S. rate on Canadian goods remains one of the lowest, and over 85% of trade between the countries is still tariff-free, because of existing exemptions to tariffs. CUSMA is scheduled for a mandatory review next year. While other countries have included multi-billion-dollar investment pledges in their trade deals with the U.S., Carney suggested that Canadian investment in the U.S. likely will decrease without a deal. We have 40 million people. We are the second largest investor in the United States and the world, he said. Without an agreement, there will be less by definition. While Trump has cited cross-border fentanyl trafficking to justify some of his tariffs, Carney said that drugs flowing from Canada to the U.S. amount a rounding error compared to other sources. Superficial to compare Canada-Mexico approaches to U.S. tariffs, Anand. Foreign Minister Anita Anand said Tuesday it would be superficial to compare the approaches Canada and Mexico have taken to navigating trade negotiations with the United States, given how different their economic relationships with the U.S. are, despite only Canada facing rising tariffs. Anand and Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne met with Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum and their ministerial counterparts in Mexico City to talk economic growth, trade, and security. The two-day trip comes as many Canadians wonder why the U.S. hit Canada on Friday with a 35% tariff on goods not compliant with the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement on Trade, known as CUSMA, while Mexico received a 90-day reprieve from threatened higher U.S. levies. The U.S. counts Canada and Mexico among its largest trading partners. U.S. President Donald Trump said last week the 90-day period would allow room to negotiate a new trade deal with Mexico, something Canada is also currently trying to secure. Asked if the ministers took away anything from their conversations with Sheinbaum that could help those talks along, Anand suggested the meeting was much more focused on Canada's relationship with Mexico and the desire for a strong North American economy. I want to stress that Canada's economic relationship with the United States differs significantly from Mexico's, she told reporters at a virtual briefing. To parse out individual elements of one country's negotiations versus our own is somewhat superficial, because the relationship is so very complex. Prior to the meeting, Mexican Economy Minister Marcelo Ebrard suggested he would be speaking with Champagne about the two countries' experiences in dealing with U.S. tariffs. They want to know how Mexico is getting these results, Ebrard told journalists. We're going to exchange experiences. They're paying a 35% tariff, and Mexico isn't. Champagne added the talks focused on strengthening partnerships with Mexico on energy, artificial intelligence, and other areas of cooperation. He said the meeting was an example of Canada's strategy of diversifying its international relationships in the face of unpredictability from the Trump administration, calling it the right strategy for Canadians. Mexico secured the 3-month reprieve after speaking with Trump directly last week. Prime Minister Mark Carney confirmed Tuesday at an event in British Columbia that he has not spoken to Trump in recent days, after previously holding several indirect conversations with the U.S. president in the weeks before Trump raised tariffs on Canada. We'll speak when it makes sense, he told reporters. Sheinbaum posted on X after Tuesday's meeting that Canada and Mexico were strengthening the relationship between our countries. Ontario Premier Doug Ford last year called for a bilateral trade deal between Canada and the United States because he said Mexico was serving as a backdoor for Chinese auto parts and vehicles entering the North American market. Those calls earned support from former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and then Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, now the Transport Minister. Anand said Sheinbaum's presence at this summer's G7 summit in Alberta, where she met with Prime Minister Mark Carney, began the process of repairing the Canada-Mexico relationship and that this week's meetings continued that process. She called the meetings productive in a post on X. These discussions with the President and members of her government advanced key shared priorities in terms of economic growth, security, and trade diversification, she added. Both Anand and Champagne stressed that CUSMA, which is due for a mandatory review next year, remains in the best interests of all three North American partners and should be preserved and strengthened.